أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الصلاة والسلام على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي ربي زدني علما. So, Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to our daily reflections in the month of Ramadan. And today, inshallah, we will be reflecting on a part of the verse from Sura Ibrahim, which is chapter 14, and the verse number is 22. In Surah Ibrahim, verse 22, Allah says, "And do not blame me, but blame yourselves." And this verse from Surah Ibrahim is part of a conversation when, on the day of judgment, mankind attempts to excuse their actions by blaming Shaytan for misleading them. And the full verse, I'd like to read the full verse as well. Here is what it says. And Shaitan will say, when the matter has been decreed, "Verily, God made you the promise of truth, and I made you a promise, but I failed you, and I had no authority over you, save that I called you, and you responded to me. So do not blame me, but blame yourselves. I cannot respond to your cries for help, nor can you respond to my cries for help. Truly, I disbelieved in your ascribing me as partner aforetime. As for the wrongdoer, surely theirs shall be a painful punishment." So Shaitan is telling mankind here that instead of blaming him for what they did, they really should blame themselves. In other words, he is declaring that he was simply an influencer. He planted thoughts and ideas in human heads. And in verse 120 of Surah Nisa, for example, he says, Allah says, He makes them promises and stirs in them desires. But Shaitan promises naught but delusion. In other words, his power is quite limited, actually. His power is to plant seeds and ideas in our heads, desires, thoughts, when we have several negative thoughts. And we need to keep reminding ourselves that the choice on whether or not to act on those thoughts always lies in human beings themselves. He cannot make us do anything. So, in the Islamic tradition, although there are demonic forces within and external to the self that can prompt one to do evil, they cannot compel us. And this is the thing that we really need to always remember, that Shaitan can attempt to lead us astray by inciting us by means of whispering, suggesting evil. In regular language, when we have negative thoughts, which we all do, by the way, against others, against ourselves, against a situation. And interestingly, even though this was Shaitan's mission, right? This was his life mission. Even he knows that ultimately his influence is limited to the extent that mankind takes action on his suggestions. And so he says, "I had no authority over you, save that I called you, and you responded to me." In other words, the choice of responding to his suggestions, the choice of taking action, always lies within us. So, what this means, in the modern world, it is so applicable. This verse, because the modern psychology, modern world, kind of continues to explain and excuse human behavior on a number of factors outside themselves over which they have no control. So, how our childhood, how we were raised as children, what kind of environment we grew up in, what situations we found ourselves in. And absolutely all of those have some influence over our lives. They shape how we think. They may make us lean into certain actions. And, Allah empowers us with free choice. Right. The thing is that blaming others for our choices is just so easy. It feels good in the moment because we do not have to deal with the pricks of conscience or negative emotions that often accompany, our poor choices and actions. Because when we see the negative impact of our actions, obviously Allah has designed the conscious as such so that it pricks us. And in order to silence that, it is very tempting to look outside and to blame an external force. However, Blaming others, our situation, is actually immobilizing, and it creates a complete feeling of powerlessness. If we continue to convince ourselves that the power and responsibility for the way our lives turn out lies outside ourselves, and that our life circumstances or someone else is to blame for what we're doing, it follows that we have no control or agency to change our situation. We need to either passively wait for situations to change or to others to make changes. Theirs is the next move. And obviously, this leads to a big victim mentality. It's not a very inspiring way to live. The reality is that many of us have gone through significant trials and situations in our lives when we did have very little power or control, especially as children. And we learned to cope the best we could. And some of those coping mechanisms worked in the moment, and they do not work as we grow up, as we age and mature. More options of action and choice are open to us. We need to remind ourselves that we have been given free will to make choices, however limited or unpleasant those choices may appear in the moment. So, for example, when there are two choices that we have, both of which seem equally unpleasant, we are very, very tempted to say, I have no choice. I had to do that because what choice did I have? And reality is that this is a kind of a lie that we tell ourselves, because we always have choice. It may be two unpleasant choices, but those are still choices. And when we accept this gift and responsibility of choice that we have been given as human beings, this is when we begin the journey of spiritual maturity and of changing the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So, remember when we were children and, we got caught, we would point to our sibling and say, he or she made me do it. But some of us haven't outgrown that habit even as adults. So, the way we can change this is we can catch ourselves every time we are tempted to pass the blame on to someone else, on to something else, on to our own thoughts, desires, and even for little things. When we start accepting responsibility for our choices, it is amazing how we begin to make better choices for ourselves. And we can only figure this out by practicing it. So let's try it. One of my favorite ways is to, when you're having a really strong negative thought, desire, emotion, practice moving your arms and legs. It sounds so strange, but it really works, because it reminds me that, what the thoughts that I have in my head are just thoughts, they're ideas, and I still have control over my actions. Even if I'm feeling angry, for example, right? Or if I am feeling grief, or I am feeling, really angry at somebody else or upset, if I move my arms and legs at the same time, I'm reminding myself that these are my thoughts, these are my emotions, and my actions, what I do with my arms and legs, is still in my control. It is really a very powerful, very simple, but very powerful way to kind of get back into taking responsibility for our choices. So, what are some of the barriers that can stand in the way? Old habits, for sure. When we keep thinking the same thoughts and doing the same things, it kind of becomes automatic. It becomes, we don't, it's, our life is kind of on autopilot, right? Not intentional. And, if we're used to passing the buck, if we're used to blaming community, society, parents, family, spouse, children, whatever that might be, right? Poverty, help, whatever the situation that we might be blaming, we may not even be conscious, right, that we are playing this blame game. So shining the light of awareness on this takes courage, and it takes practice, and we can start today. So please, one big caution: When we are practicing this, please remember this is for ourselves. It is not to point fingers at other people, how they need to take responsibility for their actions, how they could change the situation, because reality is we do not know how other people work, how, what kind of barriers they have faced in their lives. And this is certainly, please let's not use this for victim blaming or, for using it on anyone else but ourselves. If we start taking responsibility for our choices, that's the best we can do, and that will inspire other people rather than us pointing. It's always so easy to see how others are not following something, right? And it's always much more challenging to look at it ourselves. So if we were living this ayah, what would it look like? We would be conscious of how our actions or choices have created our world. We would have a sense of agency in how our life is turning out. So even when we find ourselves faced with unpleasant choices, we would still recognize that we still have a choice to make. We would understand that while others may influence our actions, no one can really make us do anything. That ability and choice always lies within ourselves, that we have choices, that when we make those choices have consequences that show up as our lived reality. And, so stopping the blame game and accepting responsibility for our choices is truly the first step on the spiritual path. So, inshallah, let's start practicing this baby steps at a time. And inshallah, we'll see you again tomorrow. So, salam alaikum.